This episode is brought to you by Nespresso Virtuo Coffee Machines. Ready to enjoy the bold flavors of barista-quality Nespresso iced coffee at home? Simply fill a glass with ice and press the brew button on your Virtuo Pop machine to enjoy rich double espressos roasted to stand up even when chilled. Refreshingly bold iced coffee. Refreshingly easy to make at home. Visit Nespresso.com to shop now.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Anthony Renzo has written the most unexpected guidebook to Rome, Pasquinades, Essays from Rome's famous talking statue. The statue in question, Pasquino, has been looking over the city for centuries, and Anthony has taken on the role of secretary for the stories and archives of the statue, letting its voice speak into existence a very unique ground-level view of Roman life. Via Pasquino, we are treated to the celebrations of Rome, the carnivals, the festivals, the traditions, the foods and flowers and sights and smells. But alongside those delights, we get the stories of human failings, of fatuous aristocrats, tyrants and popes, and the cruel many-headed hydra of Italian fascism, past and present. The friction between these two visions of one of the great ancient cities is what brings Pasquinades to life. Anthony's care and attention to the city in all of its complications brings a visceral realness to the streets and piazzas of Rome. Written with grace and care for a city he clearly loves, warts and all, Anthony has written a great love letter to Rome and its people. Anthony's previous books include Trinacria, A Tale of Bourbon, Sicily, Dead Reckoning, Transatlantic Passages on Europe and America, and Bitter Greens, essays on food, politics, and ethnicity. He teaches writing at Ithaca College. Welcome to Burned by Books, Anthony.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I love the title of this podcast. It's very Roman.
Thank you. This book is as I said, such a love letter to Rome and told by one of its famous immortal statues. What is your relationship to the city of Rome, and why did you decide you wanted to speak through one of its talking statues?
My relationship to Rome goes back to childhood, to my first visit to the Eternal City when I was around 10 years old. And I fell in love with it then and have never forgotten it ever since. So Rome is an active part in my imagination. When I went to Catholic grammar school in Freehold, New Jersey, they had this huge library of Roman classics in English translation. Virgil, Horace, Ovid. And so even at 10 years old, I'm reading this stuff, and of course the histories as well. Livy and Suetonius and Tacitus, which are unusually racy stuff for a Catholic grammar school library. But
That's true.
but it is the Vatican II, and I must say the Sisters of St. Joseph were very progressive in their pedagogy. So that, and then the I Claudius phase when I came of age, and the several trips that I went. So Rome is very much a part of my imagination, and the sense of America being the second Rome at the same time. So in many ways, I'm a citizen of two nations. And what brings it together by Italianness and my Americanness is this concern with the legacy of Rome, for good and for ill, for both countries.
That's so fascinating. And so why the statue as the voice? Why did you want to become secretary to the statues speaking that long history?
Well, my uncle Tonino introduced me to Pasquino the first time that he showed me Piazza Navona, so God's patio, as the Romans call it. So you go off that Baroque square, right off behind the Museum of Rome. You come to this tiny little square called Piazza di Pasquino, where this old statue stands. And my uncle Tonino said, I want you to introduce you to the only person in Rome who always tells the truth. And you see all these people around just looking up at him in awe and putting their gripes and complaints, but also their love letters and whatever, all at the base of this statue. The so-called talking statue tradition in Rome is a very primitive version of social media, going all the way back to the time when this statue was unearthed, allegedly on April Fool's Day of 1501, during the papacy. Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, I believe was his name in the popes. And since that time, it's been a bulletin board for the people of Rome to complain about church and state. And I thought that that was a perfect persona to enter the mindset of Rome from the street up. So the Pasquinades, as they're called, after him, these satiric settings that are placed on his pedestal, are almost always not in formal Italian, but in the Roman dialect. So those are the two things. You get the ones that are written by the scholars in classical Latin, and then the ones that are written by everyday people in the dialect of the streets. And that blend of high and low culture struck me as something that was absolutely marvelous. But I did not really feel the desire, the inspiration to write these down until two things happened. One was when Simone Schiavinato, the editor-in-chief of Little Americano, offered me the opportunity to have a monthly humor column in that bilingual Italian-American paper. And I asked if I could play the persona of Pasquino. And he thought that that was great. Because it's about your contemporary, so it's about commenting on Rome, past and present. So the original columns were extremely topical, very newsy. But even then, that sense of trying to blend the past and the present and to bring like scholarship and history as well as current events and satire were blended even in those initial columns. When Edward Hauer of Cayuga Lake Books wanted me to turn them into a collection, we moved away from journalism more toward creative nonfiction. So in the original columns, except for, I guess, the first year, Pasquino doesn't really talk to, engage with the reader. After I set up the premise in the first few columns, I just wrote it as a straight column. And nobody else needed to know about it. There are people who were familiar with Rome, who loved Italian culture, loved Roman culture. They didn't really need to be in the know. But when it came time for me to write the book, I really had to turn Pasquino into a character. So he's a narrator now, and he's engaged in, involved in the action. So for every piece that is reproduced in the book, I had to consider how and why he is telling this story, what that story means to him, and how can I involve him in the action of that story in a way that was simply not true in the original columns. The original columns were very newsy, very journalistic. These are much more novelistic almost. It's like,
oh, yeah.
So it wasn't just reproducing and editing, it was complete revision of those columns. into something else. And it took 3 years to do, and a lot of hard work. But fortunately, Edward Howard is such a marvelous editor. He's quite familiar with Rome itself, but he also had an eye toward the hidden joys in this book. So the commentaries on political scandals, the head shaking over the ironies of history were always a part of those columns. But the energy and joy that you see in this book really comes from Edward pushing me to see, yes, but Romans are not morbid. Yes, but Rome is still beautiful. So that yes part that got me to see Rome in a more positive way.
That's fascinating and such a testament to the power of good editing.
He's marvelous at it. I in many ways, I consider him the co-author of this book.
Wow, that's wonderful. So this is an account of the city that, as you say, is sort of bringing the ironies of history, past and present, into conversation. And the accounts are a mixture of the carnivalesque and the tragic, with wine festivals and New Year's celebrating, sitting side by side with fascist brutes and plagues of all kinds. What was interesting to you about calling to our attention the juxtaposition of such tonally different histories?
Well, those elements of the grotesque, as you call them, are really embodied in the carnivalesque itself. So if you know Mikhail Bakhtin, he's
my favorite,
one of my favorite critics and semi-editions, when his great work on Rabelais, where he talks about the festival life of medieval culture, which so informs Rabelais' work, and Rabelais is a wonderful writer, one of my influences. So that's what I wanted to do. But along with that, there's this kind of historic materialist dialectic that goes on in the passages. So one, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, on and on and on, so that life is a wonderful, terrible carnival where every authority figure ends up being the clown on the dunking stool, eventually. So it's this constant sense of fall and renewal of death and rebirth, which I think gives the collection its energy, which is why everything builds toward that final piece about Goethe and his experience of death and rebirth at the Roman Carnival, which completely transformed him as a person and as a poet. And that seems to be everything builds toward that. You begin with the city and that sense of utter chaos in the centro storico, a chaos that is mitigated and mediated by all this structure at the same time. So Rome is both a city of great layouts of buildings, very architecturally perfect, and at the same time pure bedlam. Right? So you move to that. So you move to, but what causes that? Well, part of it is that we move on to the seasons and to human desires, which are of course contradictory and chaotic. But then these are then celebrated and mitigated through festivals and holidays. And we need those festivals and holidays because Rome's history is one long history of oppression and whatever. So however exalted you may feel in Rome, you constantly aware also of the weight of the past on you at the same time, right? So it's like this coffee press, right? So you make this really, really dark espresso with the history of time pushing down on you to go with this really, really dark, rich coffee that comes out of you, out of the meditation of all the bitterness, the experiences that you have. So I go through that. There's a whole passage then after that celebratory stuff where we move away from, so what makes life bearable, food, and then art. And there's a reason for that because you have to deal with popes, right? So we go from the Papal States to the House of Savoy to the fascists, right? So there are those three sections on history, and then back to death and judgment and cataclysms and the plagues of war. And at the very, very end is that sense of rebirth, right? This Nietzschean sense of finding joy in tragedy, amor fati, to love your fate. I mean, you're just, it's in some ways, it's an accident where you're born and how you're born, and yet you have to make that accident meaningful by how you claim it. but not just in this kind of philosophical sense, but in that deep, passionate zest for life that Romans have. And that's why everything ends with, they call it that final section of the book, which is called an appetite for living, where I just take you back to great food, and you end with the epilogue, which is Pasquino taking you to a gelateria while talking about Goethe and life and rebirth in Rome.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite examples of this work you're doing with the kind of friction in tonality and the carnivalesque is the description of chrysanthemum flowers that tourists purchase at the particular season, but which have a much darker history of death. Even you link it to Emperor Hirohito presenting Mussolini with the Order of the Chrysanthemum.
Right.
And I wonder how you landed on chrysanthemum flowers as this fascinating kind of multitude.
Well, they're also here in the United States. In funeral homes, they use mums, right? So the chrysanthemums are also a flower for the dead here in America, but we don't know why. Of course, if you go down to New Orleans, where they use the chrysanthemums, you go to those wonderful old world cemeteries that they have down there. You think of the carnivalesque, you think of the beauty of New Orleans culture, the jazz funerals, where everybody's marching out there to the Camposanti, as we Italians would call them, and they're singing, "Oh my, how we ambled," right? They play those wonderful songs, and then they decorate all the graves, and they picnic among the dead, and they tell wonderful stories. So what I want to do is take them out of the hothouse and take them out of the Hallmark cards and put them back in their original position. So in fall, the city of Rome is just full of chrysanthemums. They overflow everywhere in the Campo de Fiori market, sometimes on the steps of the Spanish steps at Piazza di Spagna. But I want to talk about they're also, fatal. They're bad omen. So when Americans give chrysanthemums around that time, Italians will revive with all this kind of superstitious dread and flee them, which is why then I decide to talk about why, at least in Roman culture, why that is so. To talk about King Uberto's brother, Prince Amedeo, who became very briefly during the 19th century the King of Spain, and how chrysanthemums marked his life as a series of comic disasters, ending, of course, with his untimely death.
The McDonald's Snack Wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch Snack Wrap. Spicy Snack Wrap. You broke the internet for a snack. Snack Wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
It's clear throughout Pasquinades that you want to pay tribute to the specificity of the smells and sounds of sights of Rome. I wonder what your craft process was like in evoking the street level textures of the city, and how much time have you spent in Rome over the last decades?
Why don't we answer that last question first? Although I've spent some physical time in Rome over the past few decades, it's really the way I know the city through my correspondence with relatives, all the readings that I've done over the course of my life, staying abreast of the news in the city. I read the papers almost every day. I tune in to RAI and what is happening in Rome. So there's a lot of footage in my head of that specificity. The challenge was to be specific enough to give it a kind of concreteness and vividness, yet general enough not to turn it into a guidebook. And I think that was one of the most difficult processes in the collaboration that I had with Edward. How much is enough? How much is too much?
Mm-hmm.
So Little Americano is an Italian-American newspaper that tries to educate Italian-Americans about Old World culture. So in many ways, I practice a kind of cultural journalism that was very much fact-based, that was almost like an informal lecture on a landmark, on a holiday or whatever. It was built to educate as well as entertain. But here, the whole point was to engage, to evoke, to move away from reportage and more toward poetry. So one of the things that Edward did was to make sure that it wasn't too specific. When sometimes you don't need, as every side street does not need to be identified. Only the main monuments should be identified. Not all the details are the most relevant. Choose the most important detail that has an emotional or thematic function. So in, I believe, the penultimate essay in the collection that is set with in a foraging campaign to find wild greens for mizzicata salads. In the original column, when the ladies in the Trastevere Gardening Society meet, I identify the name of the church. I talk a little bit about its background in like a phrase or two. And Edward said, that's not relevant to that. What is the most important thing about that church that is germane to the story that you want to tell? And I said, well, the fact that the spires of the church look exactly like asparagus sprouts. Every guidebook has said that. Everybody's talked about it. The fact that the original sponsors of that, I think it's a 15th or 16th century church, were the gardening consortium of the city of Rome. So when the church was built, there was that subtle little homage to the patrons. And so instead, that's all of all that historical research that I had. The only thing that remained in the book for that passage was the fact that the spires of the church looked like asparagus. And that was the process that I had to do. It was less to move away from that. We talked about other writers that could invoke the city. So you think of Alberto Moravia, where however vivid Rome is in his stories, he very rarely identifies a landmark. Jhumpa Lahiri now in her Roman stories, which are homage to Alberto Moravia's, the same way. She'll a few ones and a few landmarks, but she doesn't turn it into a Google map. So that was hard for me because I work as an academic. I lecture a lot. I worked as a technical writer, as a publicist. So getting information out there and educating people is my default setting. To move more toward creative nonfiction, to allow myself the liberty of writing more like a poet was, I think, probably one of the liberating parts of this project. And I think the exhilaration, at least of that energy, is evident throughout the course of the collection.
It is. And that idea of moving away from utilitarian knowledge production into something like aesthetic surprise or aesthetic awakening, I think you can really feel chapter by chapter being drawn into these narratives to think alongside Pasquino, not necessarily to just digest information, but to see what's being seen and to think with the statue. And so I love that part very much. I mean, you mentioned the foraging. Is it agretti that they're foraging?
Exactly right. They are looking for agretti.
And I really loved this chapter in particular because of the way in which you use it to talk about the lockdowns, the COVID lockdowns, and then this just innate, almost feral desire to, be out in the world. And I wonder if you could talk about that, the way in which the COVID lockdowns and this foraging for agretti became something meaningful.
Well, the piece that precedes that essay, which actually details almost this terrible judgment on Rome during the lockdown, the fact that they poo-pooed it, They were convinced that the pandemic was really going to be limited to northern Italy, and then it hit Rome like a bomb. And everything locked down, and people began to die in droves, and the vans coming through the streets full of the dead. And Romans live outdoors. And this has been true since Juvenal's time. If you read those satires, the life of Romans takes place in the streets, which is why their houses are, relatively speaking, small. Apartments are fairly bare. Refrigerators are no bigger than like wine coolers because they'll only buy enough groceries for one day, right? They like to go out and do their groceries. So to be locked down like that, Italians are very gregarious, but Southerners, like Romans, Neapolitans, Palermitians, they love to be out in the streets. So to see that and to actually witness this almost sense of imploding, like a dwarf star collapsing in on itself, and the sheer gravity of the sorrow of the loss of light, of hope, of conversation. At first, people would go out into the balconies and sing to each other, but then that didn't seem to work. And so it was only the listening to the church bells, sing the Angelus, watching the Mass on television, not whether or not most Romans are irreligious, but still to watch it almost as a kind of ritual, whereas at the Good Friday service, when Papa Francesco did the Stations of the Cross out in the open all alone. So that was a very, very difficult and painful essay to write, to almost relive all that death and all that sorrow. So by necessity, the sequel to that is about when everything comes back, right? So things are even prepared at the end of that. The previous essay, the things are already beginning to get better. The cardinals are joking. People are trying to go back to the bookstores. And there we go, a city deserted.
The Pasquino's position over Rome for the long and deep history of that society allows a vision of change and transition, but also the ways in which things don't change at all. And you recount so many instances of history repeating itself in painful, hilarious, absurd ways. Which episodes of that repetition stand out to you the most from the book?
I would have to say the essays in which the careers of Rienzi and the careers of Mussolini are juxtaposed, since the two men ended up dying almost exactly the same way, torn to pieces by a mob and hung upside down by their heels. And in both cases, it was the fatal legend of Roman greatness that contributed to their megalomania, that got them to fire up crowds, that convinced them that they had actually resurrected the past in some meaningful way, and which led them to terrible, terrible bouts of hubris that cost them and their followers their lives. And at the same time, it's also in many ways grotesquely funny, right? So in many ways, if Rienzi's story is the tragedy, Mussolini's is almost this parody, the farce of it in the way that he relives it. And you recall that the end of the essay on Rienzi, where we actually have an old socialist buddy of Mussolini on the eve of his declaring war on the Allies. So it had to be just the summer of 1940, right? When he said, your career this will not end well. Your regime will end poorly, Benito. Such things always do. And Mussolini just grimaces in mock horror. You'll die like Rienzi. And Mussolini shows his friend his fingers. He holds out his hands. And so you see, I wear no rings like Rienzi did, which is what gave him away when he tried to hide from the mob. So it will never happen to me. And of course it did.
That's so fascinating.
Right. So one thing you must understand about this book, which a lot of people probably won't, is however sledgehammer the ironies might be, or that's just too good to be true. Se non è vero è ben trovato, if it's not, it should be true. It's all fact-checked, right? So these quotes would seem like terribly absurd and too ironic. They're all true. So that story is a true story. There's very, very little that I did with the material to make it fit into the narrative structure of the book. Almost no historical facts were changed. The dates are all accurate. And even to a lesser extent, the stream of consciousnesses that I reproduce are very much taken from archival sources, where either the participants talk about what they were feeling or what they were thinking, or that chroniclers of the time speculate about what those people were thinking or what people said that these people were thinking. So that it's not just me playing with the facts, it's going back and seeing how the chroniclers of the time played with those facts.
I like that very much. Pasquinades is a book deeply invested in thinking about the idea of belonging. In particular, who gets to belong in Rome and who are the gatekeepers who seek to limit what that belonging looks like. What do you see in the city that speaks to this fraught issue of belonging?
Well, it all goes down to how the new immigrants are being treated, particularly the Afro-Italian generation. There are Romans who are open to these new Italians, who love and support them, who understand that Rome was always a city of asylum. It was, in fact, founded that way. So the city on the hill, the village in the bogs, in the marshes that nobody wanted to go to, we know, despite the legends of Romulus and Remus, it was a kind of Australia, as a kind of penal colony, or where refugees and renegades and runaways and fugitives all went to try to make a life for themselves. That is an historic fact. The oldest neighborhood in the city, the part of the neighborhood that claims to be the Trastevere district, which in fact is, on the day that we're recording, this is the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which is also the feast of Our Lady of Trastevere. So the great festival of Noiantri, us, others, is going to get ready to kick off today. So I think of the heart of Rome, the best part of Rome for me, is the Trastevere district, because they remember coming from elsewhere. So at this time of saying we're the oldest Romans, we're the truest Romans, they know that they were from other parts of the Italian peninsula, that they were also from the Middle East, that a lot of them were Jews. So the most Roman part of Rome is a melting pot. Mm-hmm. That has been a melting pot for so long that some people forget it's a melting pot. But those who live there remember, and those who live there and honor the spirit of the Trasteverini understand that these new people are Romans as much as anyone else. The fact that the statuary that we have now in the forms and the other landmarks are washed white now, but they were in glorious color back then, right? So it's much more like the interior of a Catholic church than anything in the British Museum. And the skin tones were not white skin tones, right? They had a whole range of people, just they're like 3 or 4, the Severian dynasty were from North Africa. So one of the things that makes me a Latinist rather than a Hellenist is that sense of humanitas. Cicero coined that phrase. Not only that sense of to see the humanity in other people that are not like you, but also to recognize that we're all part of the human race. And that concept, which supposedly is the bedrock of American identity, is actually a very Roman concept, although they did not always honor it. Nevertheless, they're the first ones to really create it. So those who understand that, who honor that, and make the city open to everyone, there's that wonderful proverb, Rome was never anybody's stepmom, right? So Rome is Mother Rome to everyone, to all people.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
I'm always looking for ways to show my cat how much I love her. And with Fancy Feast gems, I can pamper her whenever I want with a savory gravy on top of a gourmet mousse pâté. The pyramid shape makes serving simple, so all I have to do is peel and plate to make mealtime feel extra fancy. And with 2 entrees in every pack, it's easy to turn every day into the extraordinary. Fancy Feast gems.
Those who live that way, they're into belonging, into open the city to everyone. Rome is an open city in the sense of everyone. Into power and then that's something else, right? And I don't have to tell you that that's a cut.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
I just find that very interesting. So when, as an Italian American, as a first generation American, people talking about how new America is. Well, yes, but to me is also something very, very old. It is in many ways the redefinition of that kind of Romanitas, for good and for ill. And you can see right now we're at a moment in which those two Romes are competing with each other over the next election.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. Anthony, before I let you go, I'd love to know a little bit about what you're reading and loving recently. And I know my listeners would be hungry for some great recommendations.
Well, I just finished a marvelous book by my dear colleague John Kihei called Following Caesar: From Rome to Constantinople, the Pathways That Planted the Seeds of Empire. And it's one of his best books. He's a well-known travel writer, but more than that, he's a first-rate journalist, he's an historian. And what he does is he follows the path of the 3 main highways of Rome, the Villa Appia, the Villa Traiana, and the Villa Egeria, across from between Rome and Constantinople and back, following in the footsteps of Horace and Cicero, Caesar and Octavian, of Antony and Brutus, and of course Paul the Apostle, right? So the Balkans down to the Greek peninsula and back again. And you can see how much those roads are still used now in the modern highway system, how they continue to shape the landscape and influence the people and the culture. And these things are literally under our feet, but we don't realize it, right? And I think that if people are interested in seeing how the past and the present are the same thing, they should read that book.
Oh, it sounds so good.
It is. It's just marvelous. It's a beautiful read. And one of the things, many things I love about this is John in this book really shows off his classical learning in a way that he's not really had to do that in past books. And you can see how much writers like Livy and Tacitus, and the two Plinies, can still influence modern prose.
Well, that's a really wonderful recommendation. I want to make sure that my listeners go out and get Pasquinades, Essays from Rome's Famous Talking Statue by Anthony de Renzo. It is, whether you have a long-term love affair with Rome, or it is a city that's sat on the periphery of your imagination and you've been wanting to know more, it is a poetic, transporting vision of a city with a long, complicated history written by someone who holds the city dear in his heart. Thank you so much for the conversation, Anthony. I've learned so much. The book has come alive in new ways for me.
It was a real be here, just like a Roman coffee house.
That's what we hope. Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Anthony Renzo for coming on to talk about his latest book of creative nonfiction, Pasquinades. You can find links to purchase Pasquinades and all of Anthony's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.